Today, we're going to move the civil rights movement into the 1960s. As you hopefully remember from last time, the civil rights leaders were focusing on two basic ways of trying to combat discrimination and segregation. One was legal challenges to existing laws, successful in Brown v. Board, and the second was economic pressure, represented by the Montgomery bus boycott. And so we're going to focus a lot on the direct action, specifically economic attacks, in order to try to force integration. And then we're going to look at some more legal and legislative ways of trying to push for greater rights. Obviously, there was a significant amount of resistance to integration from a variety of interesting individuals who had some somewhat outlier opinions about about integration in general. And as we hopefully remember, the South fought back against Brown v. Board by closing public schools and establishing a parallel system of private schools in order to keep segregation going. So obviously, it's going to be a very difficult path to try to force integration. So, one of the ways that integration was forced was economic pressure. Sit ins were African Americans going into restaurants because, of course, it's now illegal now, or there should be illegal to segregate. They would go and sit in these restaurants and ask to be served. And of course, the establishments would refuse to serve them. And this would, and then they, and oftentimes the restaurants would then close down. And so then these African Americans would go in the next day and do exactly the same thing. The Greensboro Five, probably the most famous of these. These were college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, trying to desegregate Woolworth's deli counter. It was a popular lunch spot, so they'd go in there, sit down, and then generally, suffer some pretty unpleasant abuse from angry patrons. But again, a scene would be created, and because the restaurant doesn't want the place to get trashed, they would close down. And so, by constantly putting pressure, they forced these establishments to serve African Americans. And this movement spread from Greensboro, North Carolina, across the country. There were sit-in movements in Wichita, Kansas, and other more local places. And so, by by basically putting economic pressure and again being willing to suffer just horrendous abuse, these young activists were able to force integration in restaurants. Freedom rides were a movement by a group called CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and they were to challenge the ban on say on segre or the ban on integration in interstate travel. The basic goal is white people and black people get on a bus, travel across the country. You can see here there were a number of different routes in order to challenge these state laws that banned that banned or sorry, the state laws that banned integration, that enforced segregation. And so, with the idea that then the federal government would have to step in to protect. The Freedom Rides went successfully through the parts of the northern South, but when they got to Alabama and Mississippi, things went south. Uh, Outside of Birmingham, the one of the buses was bombed. The riders were pulled off the bus and beaten by angry mobs, and then the other bus was also blown up. And so the freedom rides, at least through the deep south, ended in failure, but they raised awareness of the problem, and especially as the opponents of segregation, of integration, started using mob violence, support for the freedom riders continued to grow. So yes, a number of people were injured. Freedom riders themselves were arrested for disturbing the peace and breaking segregationist laws, but they ended up getting their message out. And as images like this played on news coverage across the country and across the world, the government increasing pressure was put on the government to do something about this civil rights problem. What we get is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference stepping up and going and trying to take on segregation in public spaces. So, the Albany Campaign was a campaign led by MLK to try to force the city of Albany, Georgia, to allow for African Americans to use public facilities. They staged nonviolent protests, but unfortunately for the protesters, the authorities nonviolently arrested everybody and the protest fell apart. And so, what the Albany campaign taught MLK was that he needed to go to places that would create greater publicity and be willing to significantly expand the scope of the campaign. And so, probably MLK's most famous civil rights movement or civil rights campaign was the Birmingham Campaign, where MLK and his group descended on Birmingham, Alabama, one of the most segregated and one of the most strongly resisting cities in the nation. The Alabama's police commissioner, or Birmingham's police commissioner, Bill Bull Connor, pledged to use any force necessary to stop these outsiders from coming in and stirring up trouble. And this was exactly what MLK wanted. And so the Birmingham campaign was nonviolent protests trying to end segregation and improve or get rid of Jim Crow laws. And as more and more of the marchers got arrested, simply more of the marchers came in. And MLK was, of course, arrested and thrown in Birmingham jail, where he wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, describing his basic or philosophy of nonviolent action and resistance. Obviously, talking about descending on this place because justice was here, and that you needed to, let's see, quote, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation." And so MLK and his supporters refused to bail themselves out of jail. And so the Birmingham jail filled all the way to capacity, and then people kept marching in the streets. So this is when the police became increasingly violent in their repression, and especially high school students were taking time off of high school and marching, were being attacked by fire hoses, or being sprayed by fire hoses, attacked by dogs, beaten by police officers. And these images, again, because of mass media, were being beamed into the images of every American house and houses around the world. And so this led to increasing pressure for the government to step up and actually do something about civil rights. One of the other things is the increasingly violent tactics of segregationists helped build support for the civil rights movement. Specifically, the Birmingham church bombing. A group of white supremacists bombed a church in Birmingham, killing 4 children in order to disrupt a civil rights meeting. And this also built momentum and support. MLK used this momentum to launch his famous March on Washington, where he gave his famous I Have a Dream speech from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And all of this public support finally pushed the Johnson administration to embrace civil rights. And so, with all of this, with public support changing and more sympathy growing for the integrationists, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, which, I mean, of course, hopefully you're thinking, well, why do we need a Civil Rights Act? I thought the Constitution in the 14th Amendment already said that equal protection under the law was guaranteed. And yes, it does. But again, like the Constitution can say whatever it wants. If the government doesn't enforce these laws, then nothing's going to happen. So the Civil Rights Act provided teeth for the 14th Amendment, and it prevented put pressure specifically on the South to repeal Jim Crow laws and to actually create equal protection under the law. One of the big so the Freedom Summer campaign and the death of 3 activists in Mississippi. This was dramatized in the movie Mississippi Burning. Also helped build support for this Civil Rights Act and the need for protection for both civil rights advocates and African Americans. And so, with all of this, MLK is invited to the White House for the signing of the Civil Rights Act. And here he is shaking hands with President Lyndon Johnson. And the Civil Rights Act becomes law. So an example of this is it creates specific non-discrimination laws and also penalties for violating these. And so you can now file civil charges under the Civil Rights Act, and these become federally mandated cases, which means, of course, that the all-white juries of the South no longer have jurisdiction, and they're going to be decided in federal courts, which are theoretically less prejudiced, theoretically. So in the election 1964, Johnson is running on a variety of different things. Obviously, he's running somewhat on the sympathy of the death of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and he's running on the record of the Civil Rights Act. So Johnson's going to get renominated, or he's going to get nominated for the first time, I should say. His running mate is going to be Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota. Not that you need to know that, but yeah. And he's going to run on, calling back to both Kennedy and then some of the other great Democratic presidents. obviously Truman, and then Roosevelt. And so Johnson's platform is something called the Great Society, which is going to include civil rights plus a whole series of New Deal style economic reforms that Johnson's going to back. In contrast to this, uh, the Republicans are going to nominate Barry Goldwater of Arizona, who's a very conservative Republican, a very anti-elitist, anti-liberal, anti-East Coast. Famously, once said that as it says here, that if we just sawed off the eastern seaboard of the country would be better off because all of those Ivory Tower liberals don't know what they're talking about anyway. And so the Johnson campaign, of course, capitalized on Goldwater's extremism, running an ad, which I'll post on Classroom, where they literally sawed off the eastern seaboard and had it float away. But where Johnson really crushed Goldwater was on the Cold War. Goldwater was a staunch Cold Warrior, had advocated potentially for using nuclear weapons in Korea, was much more hardline. The Goldwater campaign countered Johnson's accusations of extremism with a very clever sort of slogan arguing that, yeah, we need to be stronger against these things, against the federal government getting involved in states' rights, stronger against communism, stuff like that. And the Johnson campaign incredibly cleverly countered this with this slogan, which resonated much more with the American public at the time. And so Johnson ran the famous Daisy ad, which I'll also post on Classroom, to basically warn Americans. It only ever aired once, but it affected everyone's perception of Barry Goldwater. And as you can see here, the election was in no way close. Johnson swept all of the states that were not the Deep South or Goldwater's home state. And what's noteworthy here is what we're seeing the Solid South finally abandoning the Democratic Party ever since the Republican Party had been a thing, the South had voted strongly Democratic. And it takes the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Democrats embracing civil rights to finally turn the Solid South and flip them to the Republican leaning or Republican dominated, I shouldn't even say leaning, region they are today. So Lyndon Johnson becomes president. He gets his own 4-year term, and we're going to deal much more with him tomorrow. So, with the Civil Rights Act passed and Johnson reelected on a relatively civil rights friendly platform, civil rights advocates now began to target voting rights. And so, the famous event for this, of course, is the Selma March, which is dramatized in the movie Selma, which you should probably go watch. But organized by MLK, it was a march from Selma to Montgomery in order to help support some striking down some of the restrictions that have been placed on voting in the South. And of course, hopefully you remember things like poll taxes, literacy tests, a variety of different sort of barriers have been developed in the years after the Civil War to disenfranchise African Americans in the South. So their goal was to draw attention to these things, and the same way that the Civil Rights Act would provide teeth for the 14th Amendment, the Voting Rights Act would provide teeth for the 15th Amendment. The march, of course, was disrupted, and the marchers were violently attacked, which created the same type of sympathy that was created in the Birmingham campaign. And the Johnson administration was forced to, or pressured to, sign the Voting Rights Act of 65, which put the elections of states with a history of disenfranchising people under supervision of the federal government, which a number of states remain to this day, although they're starting to remove the sort of mandatory federal supervision of Southern elections. So, Voting Rights Act provides teeth to the 15th Amendment. So here's Johnson signing in the famous Voting Rights Act, which will eliminate many barriers to African Americans voting and will significantly increase political participation for African Americans. So, with these legal victories in their pocket, the civil rights movement starts to fracture to some degree because there's disagreements on where to go next. Because obviously, racism is still a thing, discrimination is still a thing. Restrictive housing contracts in the North are banning African Americans from the suburbs. People are not getting jobs because, or not being, not getting equal consideration for jobs because of their race, things like that. Obviously, neighborhoods are still segregated based on race, and so schools are still segregated based on race. And see, Malcolm X famously pointed out that the New York City school system was as segregated as any in the South, but because there wasn't a specific law mandating it, it was legal. And so advocates of integration start pushing for more drastic measures. For example, busing students to schools to try to integrate them more completely, to sort of break up the neighborhood balance. This gets significant. This gets significant pushback. They also push for affirmative action, which is allowing race to be a positive category in people's job applications or college applications. There's basically two types of affirmative action. One is if two candidates are equally qualified, then the minority or underrepresented candidate would get the job. That's one version. The other version is establishing quotas, saying a certain percentage of your school or workforce must be from disadvantaged groups. So these were two of the ways that they were pushing back against discrimination. And this is where the civil rights movement starts to fracture because leaders disagreed going forward about what the goal should be. This divide is sort of encapsulated by the divide between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King Jr. was, of course, more of an accommodationist and was more in favor of working with white people and tried to integrate society, whereas Malcolm X became more of a black nationalist, arguing that African Americans could never really achieve equality and needed to create their own parallel institutions. And so, more radical parts of the movement start to split off from the more mainstream parts of the civil rights movement with predictable results. Groups like groups like Students for a Democratic Society become taken over by what's called the Black Power movement, which there's some documents in there, but it's associated with Stokely Carmichael, and it's a Black nationalist movement and Black separatist movement. The Black Power movement is often encapsulated by wearing a black glove, and this is the famous Mexico City '68 Olympics, where John Lewis famously wears a black glove and gives the Black Power salute while the national anthem is playing. And you get separatist groups like the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X was a member of the Nation of Islam, and the Nation of Islam argued that, sorry, it was founded by a guy named Elijah Muhammad, and it argued that Islam was a much more friendly and native religion to people of African descent than Christianity. The Nation of Islam encouraged a type of black solidarity that was separate from the inclusive message of MLK's civil rights movement. And so it encouraged supporters to take new names and to convert to Islam. And so, for example, the boxer Cassius Clay became Muhammad Ali. Lou Alcindor became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and we got this group of black Muslims. The Black Panthers were another more radical group who argued that if the police couldn't be depended on to be not racist and to defend African American communities, that they should arm themselves and take matters into their own hands. And so the Black Panthers were an armed militant sort of militia protecting African Americans, and which, of course, practicing their constitutional right to open carry really freaked out a lot of people within the United States. But they also provided community services, things like that. So Black Panthers were a more hard edged part of the movement. And there was significant unrest in the 19 in the in 65, 66, 67. And I'll post some videos about this so you can understand the scope of it. But race riots affected many major cities. And I know it's counterintuitive to think that, like, right as gains are happening is when there would be so much unrest. But the Los Angeles riot was probably the largest one, the Watts riot. But there were riots throughout all of these cities during this time. And there's a real sense of, like, okay, the Civil Rights Act is passed, the Voting Rights Act is passed. Why isn't my life getting better? And a real pushback against sort of the conditions that African Americans were being forced to live under. And of course, this had the predictable effect as well of creating a lot of fear within sort of the larger general community that all of these changes were what's leading to that unrest. And so it was leading to some support to fall away from the civil rights movement from some moderates. Uh, the government commissioned a study called the Kerner Commission to figure out why African Americans were rioting. And you'll be shocked to hear that it turned out that African Americans were upset because of years of discrimination for locking them out of political and economic prosperity. So, yeah, who would have thunk? But these riots were incredibly devastating, and so it's important to note that in the end, the National Guard had to be called out to put down these riots. And I encourage you to watch the videos that I'm posting. It's intense. And then MLK gets assassinated. In '68, MLK was moving to attack more of these social and economic issues. And so he went to Memphis, Tennessee to help support a sanitation workers' strike and to draw attention to the economic plight of African Americans as part of his pivot, what he called the Poor People's Campaign. And so, as he was outside of his motel in Memphis, Tennessee, he was shot by a white supremacist and was killed. In the end, a guy named James Earl Ray was convicted of the crime and was arrested. But MLK's death really turned the civil rights movement in a real way because the response to MLK's death was even larger, massive riots. You can see in the blue areas all experienced riots during this time period. And so any hope of sort of peaceful reconciliation, continued progress, really died along with MLK. And so the civil rights era, at least for African Americans, really comes to a close in '68. And we're not going to see any massive change or progress after this. Although people still, of course, are fighting for civil rights and the movement has sort of changed, but the broad civil rights movement really does end in '68, the death of MLK.